So yes, here I am, very pleased to be here. We're going to talk on this topic today, as Gavin introduced, and when he mentioned that Nick and I were the first double feature for the register lectures, what I came to think of immediately was the only other double feature that I know of, which is this movie from about a decade back, double feature movie by Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez. I don't know if you've seen it, but that's what came to mind for me. But then when I thought about it a little bit, I realized that it's actually pretty fitting. So actually what I will be talking about here is how to death-proof automated vehicles. That will be my topic. How do we make sure automated vehicles are safe enough to be deployed? So there are stats out there, like Gavin says, but there's still a lot of work to be done on testing for safety and acceptance. And then I'll get into my specialty, which is mathematical modeling of behavior and how that ties in with this. And then the second part of this movie double feature is Planet Terror, a zombie movie, because then when we have these safe automated vehicles, these zombie vehicles running on our streets, we don't want that to be the apocalypse, right? We want a society that uses these vehicles in nice ways to build a society the way we want it, right? So that's what Nick is going to get into. Okay, very good. So obviously these topics, they are cross-cutting, cross-disciplinary, as most topics with in relation to automated vehicles. The harder sciences, engineering and so on one side, and psychology, social science and so on the other. By means of further introduction, it might be worth pointing out that both Nick and I are sort of in the middle here a little bit. So I'm an engineering physicist by training, trained to do maths and that sort of thing. As Gavin mentioned, I've done a bit more than a decade in the auto industry doing safety work. But all that time I've sort of been clawing my way over to this other side to do mathematical models of psychology and that type of phenomenon. Whereas Nick, on the other hand, is a trained psychologist now working at Bosch. So we're sort of bridging this divide from two different directions in one sense. Okay, that introduces us a little bit. I think in terms of introducing automated vehicles in 2019, I think this sort of graph might be one useful thing to get out there to clear the air a little bit, because obviously you've all heard a lot about automated vehicles over these last few years, and to some extent it started, I mean, it's debatable exactly when, but maybe 5-7 years ago, a bunch of technological developments sort of converged in a way that we could feel that actually some stuff is gonna happen here. We're gonna be able to become quite a lot more capable in terms of what we can do with cars that drive themselves, right? So we could anticipate some sort of leap in technological capacity, and I think that's fair. That's happening, will continue to happen for a while. But obviously what happens at the same time then is this curve, right? Expectations on technology. You might have seen it before as the hype curve, right? So you get to this peak of inflated expectations, as it's sometimes called, and then people get a bit disappointed and go into the trough of disillusionment, and hopefully at some end will sort of stabilize a bit at some sensible plateau of productivity. So I thought I'd just out of interest, I could maybe do a quick poll with you guys here. If you would just please raise one hand in the air and put a number of fingers up to tell me where you think we are on this.
Where we are, or where we are?
Where society is more. Where society is more or less. 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3. Yeah. So I'm getting around here. Which I think is fair. I mean, I don't have the right answer, but I mean, this is my gift to you in terms of your stock investment from today. We're probably somewhere here. Yeah, I think that's a good assessment. We're I don't think we're on the rise anymore, but then that's a question whether have we passed the peak, have we reached the trough? I'm not sure, but what is clear is that they were supposed to be here now, right? If you go back a few years and look at 2016, for example, you would see Elon Musk, I think looking visibly younger, at that point saying, by the end of next year, they'll be completely self-driving. And also the bigger companies got on the same bandwagon, or whatever you want to call it. Ford, for example, saying 2021. But both of these things, then if you look now today, these last few weeks, Elon Musk is still saying the same thing, sort of next year. And Ford is saying, no, not 2021. It's going to be later than that. So we haven't lived up to those expectations, and it's not clear exactly what's going to happen. So why is that? I guess in part it's just this hype curve, right? That's the way it works. But there's also been some notable events, crashes, people killed in and around automated vehicles, which has sort of tempered expectations a bit. There's this famous one in Arizona, which I believe is the first one where someone not in the self-driving vehicle was killed, right? Which is an important aspect, about a year ago. And then you might have seen reports that Waymo, this Google company, Alphabet company, running very advanced vehicles in some places in the US, they've been seeing some harassment. People don't like their vehicles. So part of that is because some people are worried about this zombie apocalypse, if you will, that Nick is going to talk about. I mean, if you excuse the term, worried about automation and where that's going to take society, right? But part of it is also that people have concerns for safety. They feel they're part of an experiment without having been asked whether it's okay that they're part of an experiment. Their kids are part of that. And there are also voices saying that they hate how these cars drive. So they're overly cautious, they get stuck. So they're a nuisance in that way. So all of this raises a bunch of questions, and some of them, quite a lot of them, relate to testing. So that's what I'm going to talk about to some extent today. How to test automated vehicles for safety and acceptance. Is it okay to test on public roads? What requirements should we set before deployment? And what is making it so difficult anyway? Why has it been more difficult than what people thought? These first three questions are super difficult. I don't have straight answers. I'll sort of scratch the surface and show you a little bit how people are working on it. This one is easier to answer, and I think you might have your own ideas. The difficulty lies in complexity, right? So it's the difference between a type of situation where we can easily do automation, like a driverless train, a closed environment. We can predict very clearly what's going to happen for the most parts, as opposed to traffic, right? It's just orders and orders of magnitude more complicated. And we can all, to some extent, relate from our own experience of having learned how to drive in complex driving environments when we got our driver's license. It's not necessarily an easy thing, right? And what's becoming more and more clear is that it's not only difficult to figure out how to build it technologically, but also how to test it and know when is it good enough. So if you think back to your own experience of getting your driver's license, maybe one question you could ask yourself is, can't we just test an automated vehicle the same way we test humans? And some people have suggested this as that should be part of licensing automated vehicles. We do a little driving test like we do with humans, and we see if they manage or not. There's some limitations to that. One of them, perhaps the most obvious one, is that part of the motivation is for automated vehicles is that we want them to be safer than us, right? So it feels like we should have a higher bar on the automated vehicles than we have on humans. The other slightly more subtle point, perhaps, is that we don't know whether the automated vehicles generalize the same way that we do. And what I mean by that is that if you watch a human driver drive for 15 or 30 minutes, I think you can get a pretty good idea of roughly how they are at driving with sufficiently challenging traffic, right? After having seen that, you're not going to worry that a little splash of blue paint on the corner of a stop sign is going to make that driver turn into the oncoming traffic all of a sudden, if it's a human, right? Whereas with a self-driving car, I mean, it might not be very likely, but you're not completely sure, are you? Because you don't, it's not a human in the end, and it is a very complex piece of machinery. So the algorithms may not generalize like we do. So one very clear type of example of that that you may or may not have heard of is these adversarial challenges to deep learning type neural networks, right? So you can get nowadays very impressive object classification performance, sort of near human level. Normally, those neural networks would say that these are all turtles, but this turtle has been specifically manufactured in such a way that it almost always gets one of the best performing nets to classify it as a rifle. And it's difficult to see on the screen, and it's even difficult to see in a high resolution, but has to do with what the texture looks like on this shell. So it sort of tells us that clearly the computer, even though it seems to behave like a human in its performance, it's doing it in a completely different way. So when we sort of push it outside of its zone, it's doing something we can't really predict, right? Which becomes challenging when you talk about driving. One aspect of that in automated vehicles is that it might make them susceptible to attacks. Like this was recently some Chinese hackers claiming that by just putting some little patches of paint on the ground, they could force a Tesla to change lanes into the wrong lane. And already now on the even if it isn't sort of an actual attempt at fooling the system, you get these sorts of limitations that might be hard to get your head around in these current on-market systems like the Teslas or Volvo. So this is from a Volvo, might be a little bit hard to read here, but a Volvo manual from last year about their pilot assist function. So that's a level 2 system, which requires the human to be attentive at all times. But it says that the camera and radar sensors do not detect stationary obstacles. So you're in this seemingly self-driving car. On the highway, you can sort of hand over to it. You have to monitor it, but it's doing well. And some, I don't think this one does lane changing, but some other, the Teslas, for example, do that. So you can have a car that seems to be driving pretty well, but then all of a sudden, when there's a stationary obstacle, something standing still on the highway, it doesn't see it. And you have to sort of get your head around that as a driver, right? So it's again, this question of how difficult it is to know. I mean, and this is still a pretty much a white box system. We know that it has this limitation, but more complicated self-driving systems, it might be more difficult to tell. Okay, so obviously what you need to do then, if you can't just test it like you test a human driver with a short test, what you do to try to see whether you have these problems with weird cases is that you have to do a lot of on-road testing, right? So that's what people are to a large extent trying to do. These are recent figures from Tesla, hit 1 billion miles with their autopilot system early 2019 and accelerating. So they're targeting mainly the sort of highway, high-speed type of scenario with their level 2 system, whereas Waymo, who are targeting more advanced self-driving straight off the bat in more sort of low-speed, more complex environments, as of end of last year, sometime about 10 million miles of self-driving. So lots and lots and lots and lots of driving. Which is great, of course. So that's the real thing. I mean, it's great in the sense that it is really the real thing. There, if there are flaws, hopefully you can detect them there. But as we've already alluded to, there are also limitations, right? And concerns. So one of them, the ethical concern of safety. It becomes essentially a big experiment where everyone on the road is a participant without having provided consent. But there could also be business concerns. Like I said, these Waymo cars, people are saying we don't like how they drive at all. It could be argued that maybe they're on the road too early from that perspective. If people come to dislike them, and creates bad will in that sense, right? And the final challenge here is cost, of course. It costs a lot of money, and arguably to some extent, when you create your next version of the self-driving vehicle, you have the challenge that all those miles you drove before, those were the previous version. How confident are you about your next version? So which is a valid concern. There's the obvious counter-argument, is that they've recorded all the log data, right? And now we're starting to get to the meat of the matter, the really difficult things. So they have these billion miles of log data, and you can replay that. So then you say, when I have my next version of the software, for example, I can just rerun all of those miles. I can maybe even fuzz it a little bit, change the parameters a little bit. But there's an important aspect in that to consider, which is that these little pink, purple things on here, which are the sort of recorded other road users, which had their movements recorded when this automated vehicle, or at least instrumented vehicle passing here, they all moved the way they did, in part because that vehicle moved the way it did, right? So as soon as your new software version changes how that vehicle drives, you don't really know any longer whether these guys would have behaved the same. It becomes sort of like an open loop testing, if you understand that term. It's not closed loop anymore. So you get now into this really sticky point of interactions. So I don't have, as do few people, enough insight into Waymo's operations to know whether this is part of why they're struggling with some interactions, it seems, but it's plausible at least, right? Which then gets me to what I like to think about, which is modeling, mathematical modeling. Because ideally then, so it might be again a little bit hard to see here, but you see in this re-simulation, you have these little boxes signifying these other things here. And they're re-simulating it and changing it a little bit. So ideally, you would want to have little mathematical models here, right? So if you could make a little equation, or presumably a pretty big equation, describing how a human behaves on the road as a function of everything else, you could just stick that into each and every one of these. And then if the automated vehicle changes its behavior, these ones will adapt accordingly, right? It's a great idea, but it's easy to say. It's very much more difficult to do, of course, because in a sense, if we had that, we could just stick those equations in the self-driving car to begin with, in a sense, almost, and that would be our self-driving car. And it's something. I mean, there's been decades and decades of research on things like traffic simulation to, for example, predict traffic flow. So we have pretty good mathematical models of how people drive on the macro scale. So you can have little simulated cars and pedestrians in a city, and you can predict traffic flow. But there's very little research, very little knowledge on this more detailed level, the sort of few agent local interaction. That's very much more an open question. We don't know much about how that works and how to model that. And that's a big part of the crux here. Okay, but we wouldn't be in the year 2019 if someone then wouldn't go, hey, we'll just throw deep learning at it. Can't we just machine learn these mathematical models of behavior? And I think it's a great idea. I'm not against it at all. I think it's a super idea. And this is perhaps one of the more advanced versions of it that I've seen. It's from a UK company called Latent Logic. So they're essentially processing raw traffic footage, detecting and tracking vehicles and road users in it, and then recreating a simulation and learning, having an agent learn these behaviors in such a way that a discriminating network can't tell the difference between that agent and the real recorded ones. So that's also, that really is a step forward, I think. I mean, the traffic simulation business is ripe for disruption. I think this is a good way to go. But there's one fundamental limitation in this as well, and that's safety critical situations. Because as you will know, if you sit yourself down at a roundabout and watch it for a whole day, you're not going to expect to see a crash, right? You have to get very, very much data to see critical situations, near critical situations, which means that you again get into this generalization conundrum, right? So you have lots and lots of data on non-critical interactions, but when it comes to those situations that you arguably cared the most about, the really tricky ones, you have almost no data at all. So you don't know whether your machine learned models generalize correctly to that. So these two things, I think, are sort of at the heart of some of the very most difficult challenges in creating truly safe and acceptable self-driving cars. And machine learned models will be an important part, but the perspective I like to take on it is a more sort of white box approach, a more cognitive or psychological approach. So I like to ask questions like, what perceptual information do humans actually make use of in traffic? How do they decide what actions to take? How do they coordinate their movement with others? Can we understand those mechanisms and try to model those? Perhaps as a complement to machine learned models. So obviously that sort of blows up a whole wide range of research questions, and we can just spend entire research careers on trying to understand that, and some people have. So I'll sort of fly down a little sliver of it to give you an idea, and I'll do that with respect to collisions and visual looming. I don't know if you've heard about that, but visual looming is essentially the term for when something is about to hit you. If a ball is thrown at your face, the image of the ball on your retina will grow over time, right? So it'll seem bigger as it comes closer to you. It looms on your retina. So that's famously not first mentioned, but it's a big part of this sci-fi novel from the 50s called The Black Cloud, where some cloud in space seems to come closer to us over time, and the researchers are wondering, when is it going to hit us? And we don't know how far it is or how big it is. But then apparently this guy was a physicist, so one of the heroes in the book, he says, well, hey, you don't need to know how big it is or how far it is. Actually, if you just do the math, and I won't talk you through it, you can do the trigonometry at home as an exercise if you want to. It's enough to actually just look at that angle on the retina, right? The angle is angle subtended by the obstacle, and how that changes over time. You get this quotient called tau, and that's actually a very good approximation of time to collision. This just falls out of it, the distance divided by speed, right? Time to collision. So you can see in this little animation, if you're driving or traveling towards something, you see the angle and rate of change of angle, and this pink thing is this tau quotient, which follows almost exactly all the way down to zero, this true time to collision. So you have a very potent visual estimate of a pretty complex thing, right? You can think about it next time someone throws a ball at you. Another interesting result, if you just take the time derivative and apply your calculus and a little bit of mechanics, you can find that actually that time derivative is exactly -1/2 if either you or that thing is decelerating just the right amount to stop right at you. So you see that in this little animation where we're slowing down to stop exactly at this thing, that now this thing is at half. So up here it's a slope of -1, right? 1 second down for each second that passes, but now it's just exactly half that. So that provides the eye a very direct way of telling whether you're successfully avoiding collision. So there's been a lot of research on to what extent humans and other animals use these types of information, and it seems we do. For example, from funky experiments like this in the 90s, where the participants were supposed to catch this ball that was coming towards them, and the experimenters sneakily inflated or deflated the ball as it was traveling, and you could see how that affected their grasping behavior. More recently, we've looked at it together with huge data sets from real driving. So this is from an experiment with or a data collection study with about 1,000 vehicles driven for a long, long time in the US. Long enough now to get actual crashes and near crashes. So then we could start looking at things like brake reaction time. So these are situations where people looked at a phone or something, looked back to the road, and they were very close to either a near crash or a crash. And then we can see as a function of, now this is the inverse of this tau thing. So larger values here mean more urgent. So here at 0.2, inverse tau, which means 5 seconds left to collision. If you are above that, longer time left to collision, people can have pretty slow reactions, whereas above it, people react very quickly. So it feeds into this idea of people using something like this to determine how to respond, right? And then interestingly, you see this downward slope. So with even more urgent looming when you look up from your phone or whatever you shouldn't have looked at, you respond even more quickly. And that gets us into perhaps even more interesting stuff where you can think about how the brain makes decisions. So there's a bunch of models dealing in what's called evidence accumulation for decision making. So there's more and more converging data both from animals, so this is from monkeys, and from humans, that what seems to be happening when we're making a decision in our brain to do something is that we're accumulating or integrating evidence up towards a threshold. So this is now recordings from a monkey, a part of a monkey's brain, and you can see that when the activity in a pool of neurons hits a threshold, that predicts very precisely when the overt response comes. So you can predict the monkey reaction time from the population response very closely. So that's something we put into models of behavior in traffic. So you can have evidence for the need of braking, for example, visual looming, that you add noise and integrate, and when it hits the threshold, you apply brakes. So we can use that type of model to explain the types of data we see from that naturalistic data set I showed on the last slide, and lots of other studies as well. Another thing we can use it for is we can use it for reconstructions, for example. So in this case, this pedestrian crash, we can look at what happened in the situation. In the actual situation, there was no braking either by the safety driver or the system. Collision ending up something like that. So with these types of models, we can say that actually, based on what we can tell from a sort of the data that's available publicly, it seems like an average human driver probably also would have crashed on average, but with a little bit lower speed, so reducing the risk of a fatality. So it was a tricky situation, to be fair, but that's not to say that there wasn't a lot of problems in what happened there. Okay, so we have some models which feed into this safety critical side of things. The other part of it I mentioned was interactions, and let me say a little bit about that as well before I hand over to Nick. Interestingly, actually, if you think about it, interactions is quite a lot also about collisions, right? And avoiding collisions. Because a big part, so the reason we have to think about each other in traffic is because we want to figure out who passes this point first, who passes this point first, who goes to the right, who goes to the left. Collision conflict resolution. So we've taken those models that we've used for the safety critical cases and we've generalized them to more sort of routine interaction situations like pedestrian crossings. So one interesting finding from the literature and maybe also from your own personal experience there is if you think of a situation where you want to cross a road and you see an oncoming vehicle and you try to figure out whether that car is stopping for you or not. I don't know about you, but quite often for me what happens is that I miss my little chance at the beginning, and then I end up crossing when the car has stopped completely, and I feel a little bit silly because afterwards it was obvious that he was yielding to me, but I anyways waited until it was at a complete stop, wasting both his or her and my time. So we wondered whether we could recreate those sorts of phenomena. So what we did then is that we experimented with more complex models. So these are now again evidence accumulation decisions, not only for crossing the road, but also suggesting that maybe the decision to cross the road is based on perceptual decisions. So like, can I make it across before the car? So now you see this tau thing turning up again, right? The time to collision estimate. So if that's bigger than some threshold, then I think I can probably cross regardless of whether the car is yielding or not. When I'm a little bit uncertain there, I can consider also this time derivative of tau to see whether it looks like the car is yielding to me. And maybe some other stuff as well. And I mean, there's lots of permutations you can do to this. And then we have tested it on various data sets, including VR data sets like this, where we can control very precisely how the car approaches in different ways. And these are now a bunch of different scenarios. You see constant speed, acceleration to a stop, deceleration without stopping. And what you see are the red things behind here are the human responses. So when people actually cross. So you see this sort of pattern that either you cross early in the situation or after the car has come to a stop, but there's this dead band in the middle or whatever where people won't pass. So that's sort of this anecdotal evidence and partial literature evidence confirmed. But interestingly also these models can capture this. So you see these lines here is the model recreating these things, and actually even in a slightly simplified form, not quite the spaghetti monster you saw on the last slide. Yeah, so we can also use these ideas to start modeling interactions, and then we can start applying them in simulation. So this is now 50 simulations on top of each other, where you see that sometimes the pedestrians get a bit uncertain and wait until the car has come to a complete stop. And then what happens is that these guys that had to come to a complete stop, it takes a while for them to regain speed. So the time loss for the car can go up to 12 seconds, an average time loss of 5 seconds in this case. And then you can start toying with things like, what if the car brakes a little bit harder, just to be a bit more clear about its intent? And you can use the model to make predictions about how much that might improve situations. So in this case, you get a significantly lower average time loss. So hopefully that's the sort of thing you can use these models to as part of improving how automated vehicles interact and get better acceptance for them. Okay, so that concludes my part of this talk. I'd say my key takeaways are two. Testing automated vehicles for safety and acceptance is a highly complex challenge. Personally, I think that we should, I mean, there's a temptation in that to say that when it is so difficult, so let's just leave it to the really smart guys at Google or whatever. But I think we need to do a little bit better than that and have some societal and regulatory oversight into what's actually happening. And doing the testing well requires an understanding of human behavior in traffic. That isn't something that we have today. And one way of getting ahead is to possibly combine machine learning methods with more cognitive science and psychological insights. Okay. And with that, I'll hand over to Nick.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, we've made our roads death-proof, and I'm going to now talk about how we avoid planet terror, thinking about the kind of society we will that will emerge when automated vehicles are available to us. But Gustav, give me a little bit of an intro. I just want to talk about my background a little. So I was doing my PhD in psychology, and I was studying actually how people catch. It was interesting. Gustav actually put up some of the research that I was using at the time. How people get from where they are to where they need to be to catch a ball. And that kind of processing of visual information, how the brain is using those visual cues to decide how to act, led me into how to study driver behaviour. Driving, obviously, a very visual task. You use what you see to guide your actions, and led me to working at the Transport Research Laboratory. So there I was using driving simulators to understand driving behaviour, things like the effect of alcohol, the effect of texting, the effect of music on our abilities to drive a car, the effect of training on fuel efficiency for truck drivers. And I found I was quite often the guy who was telling people what not to do. And that felt a bit kind of depressing, to be honest. Always being, you don't want to do it like that, you want to do it like this. And there's several other things kind of emerging as well. So at the time you had the emergence of the smartphone, so iPhone coming out in 2007, that becoming more and more popular, people becoming more wedded to their phones and living their life through their phones, and finding it difficult not to stop even when driving. At the same time, you also had the emergence of the DARPA challenges and the Google self-driving car project, and recognizing that automated vehicles were definitely going to play an important role in the future of transportation. So I pushed very strongly to start working on that topic. And I didn't have to push too hard, because the Transport Research Laboratory had a very strong history in the development of self-driving cars. So this is a self-driving car from the late 60s. Everyone recognise what that is?
DS.
Citroen DS, yeah, beautiful car. A non-standard feature is these coils on the front bumper, and they would detect the offset of the vehicle from an electric cable buried in the road. This is on their test track. And with a cruise control device, it becomes a self-driving car. So the driver in there reading a book as he goes along. Now, clearly, the practicality of digging up every road to lay an electric cable for vehicles to follow is probably what limited this as a development path. But over time, technologies have developed to make this more of a viable possibility. But it turns out, people have been thinking about these things for a very long time. So you may have come across the Asimov story Sally. Short story, it's very easy to find online. I'm going to just read you a passage from this. It's that the story's about a guy who's looking after automated vehicles that have been retired. It's set in 2057, I think it is. The thought makes me feel old. I can remember when there wasn't an automobile in the world with brains enough to find its own way home. I chauffeured dead lumps of machines that needed a man's hand at the controls every minute. Every year, machines like that used to kill tens of thousands of people. The automatics fixed that. A positronic brain can react much faster than a human one, of course, and it paid people to keep hands off the controls. You got in, punched your destination, and let it go its own way. We take it all for granted now, but I can remember the days when the first laws came out forcing the old machines off the highways and limiting travel to automatics. Lord, what a fuss. They called it everything from communism to fascism. But it emptied the highways and stopped the killing, and still more people get around easily the new way. Of course, the automatics were 10 to 100 times as expensive as the hand-driven ones, and there weren't many that could afford a private vehicle. The industry specialised in turning out omnibus automatics. You could always call a company and have one stop at your door in a matter of minutes and take you where you wanted to go. Usually you had to drive with others who were going your way. But what's wrong with that? So 1953, he's basically predicted driverless Uber. It's pretty impressive going.
I think must have read that one, actually.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the visions of the future from the early days of the motor vehicle, there have been thoughts about making this process automated. So coming on to the project that Gavin mentioned earlier, the Gateway trials that we had in Greenwich, trialling lots of different types of automated vehicle in public environments, from these driverless pods, the shuttles that are very similar, in fact, adapted versions of the ones that are at Heathrow, but operating in a completely public environment. We had some simulation trials. We had a tele-operated vehicle, so a vehicle that could be driven from a remote location. And that would mean if you're a disabled user, for example, you could park your car near the venue, get out, and then allow someone else to park the car for you. World's first automated delivery by automated vehicle in partnership with Ocado. A really interesting set of trials. But the trials were about not testing technology as such, but testing how people responded to it, and got lots of good insights about that. And working on that project is kind of what led me to working for Bosch. Now, if you ask anyone on the street what they know about Bosch, they'll probably tell you about power tools and dishwashers and garden equipment and so on. But some of the things on here, the majority of what Bosch does, the majority of revenue relates to mobility, and that's providing automotive components. So it is a strongly automotive company. It's a big company, so 400,000 employees. For context, that's the same as Ford plus GM. And one fact that's not so well known is it's 92% owned by a charitable foundation. So 8% owned by the Robert Bosch family, but the remainder is owned by a charity. So the profits that are made are used to fund good causes. So yeah, good company to work for, but very active in this space, and very dependent on revenues from the existing model of automotive production. So combustion engine components, we know times are changing when it comes to powertrain. So there is a need to start to look at new ways of providing mobility, and that's what our team's looking at. But so coming on to the topic of the talk, I think there's the topic of automated vehicles and ethics has been somewhat hijacked by the trolley problems. The idea is, should the vehicle turn left or turn right to avoid a crash? Now, I want to think more about mobility is fundamentally associated with prosperity, whether that's as an individual, you know, how you get to educational opportunities, how you get to your job, how you get to healthcare. Your mobility is linked to your prosperity. And for businesses, it's about how you get to your supply chains, your markets, how your customers reach your business. So if we change mobility in some way through the presence of automated vehicles, we change prosperity. And I'm keen to understand, you know, how the equality of that change in prosperity is achieved. And it's really important as well because, as we've seen with, on the left, the Gilets jaunes protests in Paris and the Extinction Rebellion protests in London, people can organise much more easily now, and if they don't like the situation, can cause disruption. Now, you know, the peaceful protests is all very well, but you know, sometimes things can get out of hand. We want to make sure the society we create is one that is beneficial to as many people as possible. So as I say, automated vehicles may change our mobility, and that will change prosperity. And how will we understand, how will equality be achieved in the way prosperity changes? So lots of examples on here of the sorts of vehicles many of you will have seen. The Waymo vehicle, the pods that are being used in Milton Keynes, new vehicles from Aptiv, which is the Delphi spin-off working on automated vehicles, Nutonomy, Bosch's self-driving shuttle that was released at CES. All of these could change how mobility is achieved. What does that mean for prosperity? And it's not just movement of people either. So these are two concepts for moving of goods in urban locations. So on the left, Neuro's vehicle, on the right, Starship. The Starship robots have been tested in the UK, but also in the US. But the San Francisco Board of Governors have come down against the use of these kind of pavement-dwelling robots with this kind of anticipatory regulation. They're saying, well, you know, we could accept testing of these vehicles, but if you're going to get thousands of them serving a community, then we're not actually sure we want to do that. We want to be a bit more cautious about it. So this kind of balance between innovation and protection of public rights, public safety is really critical in the way that automated vehicles will roll out. Now, when you look at the potential savings from automation, it's very tempting to try to remove the driver from a vehicle. So these are different studies looking at the relative proportion of cost associated with the driver. So for a taxi driver in Vienna, the driver represents 88% of the operating costs of the vehicle. For a bus in the same city, 55%. For a truck, a contemporary study in the US suggests the driver represents 43% of the operating costs. PwC studies indicate that with the adoption of automated vehicle technologies, about 30% of the costs of truck operations could be saved. And for industries that exist on narrow margins, that's very, very appealing to try to recoup some of those costs. But I think we have to be a bit more sophisticated in our thinking about that, because you need to take into account, firstly, the added cost of the technology, the maintenance of those systems, and then also the technological limitations of the automated systems that are rolled out. It's not a one-to-one replacement. An automated system won't be able to do everything that a human driver can, certainly not in the first iterations of this technology. And then we start to think about, okay, well, what's that job loss going to look like? This is a study from 2015 looking at what was the most common job reported in the states across America. And in 29 of the 50 states, truck driver was the most common job. Now, the International Transport Forum estimates that 6.4 million truck driving jobs will go across the US and Europe. And the US Chamber of Commerce estimated 15.5 million jobs would be affected by the implementation of automated driving. And they looked at, so which are the driving populations that would be affected and how would they be affected? Now, for motor vehicle operators, those whose job is fundamentally to drive a vehicle, a truck driver, a bus driver, and so on, their jobs will go. So some of those jobs will go. And those people in those jobs tend to be male, tend to be older, tend to be less well paid, and tend to be less well educated than the general population. Now, the other group that they identified was on the job drivers. Okay, and so these are people whose role involves driving to some degree, whether that's a travelling salesman or a police driver or something. So for them, their demographics are more representative of the typical population. And so I think we need to be aware of the jobs and the types of people who will be affected as we roll out automated driving. Now, in the US, there are two organizations that have been created to try to tackle this. You've got PTIO, the Partnership for Transportation, Innovation and Opportunity. That's about the automation industry working with the transportation industries, logistics sectors, to make sure that that transition is as smooth as possible. We know this technology is coming. How can we start the process of re-education, retraining, so that we don't end up with these big job losses, or there is a transition path? And then there's PAVE, Partners for Automated Vehicle Education. That's about working with the public, so make sure the public understand what are the benefits, what are the risks associated with automated vehicles. And in the UK, there's a similar organisation. I guess you would look at CCAV, the Centre for Connecting Autonomous Vehicles, a government dedicated policy unit combining DFT and BEIS, the business ministry, to understand how the UK should be represented and how the UK should be adopting automated vehicle systems. Okay, a couple more things. One is around a lot of these new mobility systems and automated driving systems depend on access to technology and access to banking. This is a map of the world showing where there are populations that don't have access to a bank account. And it's not just not having access to a bank account, but having access to a bank account that enables you to transact digitally. Similarly, there are significant populations, particularly in lower income countries, that don't have access to smartphones. Now, as you introduce these technologies that are fundamentally dependent on digital transactions and remote communications technologies, you are it's more advantageous to those people and disadvantageous to those who don't have access to those technologies. You need to think about how we can ensure that these new mobility services support the needs of these underserved populations. And then what might be a potential solution to this? This isn't a Bosch perspective particularly, but it's something I'm very interested in. So a couple of years ago, UCL produced a study of universal basic services. The idea that you could extend the principle of the NHS and education in the UK, that extend that to other areas of life, one of which could be transportation. Offering free bus travel to all in the UK would cost about £5 billion. If you extended that to all types of local transportation, that would be around 10 billion. And that would mean that communities would find it easier to access healthcare, to access education, to access employment. You might say, well, no chance, it will never work. Well, there have been trials of it in Dunkirk, in Tallinn, in Estonia, and in Luxembourg. And so Tallinn, it was success, and they're spreading it to the whole country. In Luxembourg, it'll be, it's gone from trial stage to across the whole country in 2020. And there seems to be value in doing this and giving people that access to mobility. And automated vehicles could play an important role in doing that. If you can get low-cost transportation using automated vehicles, does that universal basic mobility service become something that gives you that equality of access and equality of opportunity and prosperity? One criticism of it is though, what journeys does it replace? Now, some of the studies have shown that if you introduce this universal basic mobility, it's people going 1 or 2 stops, trips that they might otherwise walked and cycled rather than anything else. So there needs to be care over how that system is introduced. Now, so just in closing, really, this is the vision of mobility that Bosch intends to impose on cities around the world. No, okay, no, not quite. But what this illustration shows is lots of different ways in which mobility could be improved for cities around the world. So, we still certainly think that mass transit systems are a fundamental part of the movement of large numbers of people into and out of the centres of cities. But there will be new services, so automated robo shuttle services, more kind of hired car services, but then also more active mobility as well, so e-bikes, e-scooters, e-cargo bikes we've got down here. But I think the important thing for our team, and the important thing that we think about, is that the way that cities change, the way that mobility changes, will be fundamentally underpinned by data. So you need to understand cities from a data perspective to understand where your new mobility services can have the greatest positive impact, who will be advantaged, who will be disadvantaged by the introduction of those services, how will they change air quality, how will they change congestion, and then use that to work with the cities to help them achieve their transportation objectives. So in London, the Mayor's how can what we do help TfL achieve the objectives set out in the Mayor's transport strategy? So that's certainly the way we're thinking about how we can introduce automated vehicle services into cities in future. Okay, so just to conclude the two sessions, really, I think Gustav showed very clearly that being able to prove automated vehicle safety is going to be a huge challenge, and understanding when it is safe to introduce automated vehicles into the public realm is a very, very difficult question. Aside from the technological challenges and the regulatory challenges, that public acceptance is going to be really important. So there are lots of behavioural aspects that Gustav's looking at that will help us ensure that automated vehicles behave in ways that are intuitive for the public. The ethics of automated vehicles is about far more than trolley problems. There's a much bigger there are many more questions that we need to answer around when it is ethical to introduce automated vehicles and who benefits from their introduction. We think that the development of future services involving automated vehicles will be characterised by these public partnerships between the public and private sectors. In London, for us, it's working with TfL, but in Chicago with the Department of Transportation for the city there, in Mexico City with authorities there, understanding what their needs are and how we can use new automation to help them achieve their goals. The importance of data sharing, more and more organisations being able to share their data to understand that broader impact, whether that's around congestion, air quality, or the benefits to citizens and businesses, and then using that data to ensure that the solutions we create, solutions that we implement, serve those wider societal goals. And then hopefully we will end up with death-proof roads and we avoid planet terror. Okay. That's it. Thank you very much, guys. Looking forward to the questions.